Hi, I'm Phil Crocker and welcome to our third video on how to play better Blitz. On this video we're looking at how and when to pre-move. So far we've looked at an introductory video, we've looked at how to set up our system, and now we're going to look at how to pre-move and when to pre-move. Quite a tricky concept for particularly for over-the-board players who've never come across it before, but it can help you save vital seconds when you're playing. So the fundamentals of it we already touched on in the last video, so you'll normally need to set this up to allow the possibility in Blitz and chess.com. We looked at that in the last video. In essence, you are deciding to make a particular move before you know what your opponent's move is, which might sound a little bit odd, but if you are pretty certain that you know what you want to do, then you can save time by making your move in advance, and the system counts it as basically instantaneous. And importantly, the move is only executed if it's legal. So if you pre-move a recapture and your opponent doesn't capture, then that would normally be illegal. And if you make a particular move on one side of the board but your opponent puts you into check on the other side of the board, then your intended pre-move would no longer be legal and therefore wouldn't be executed. So on chess.com, in principle, you can execute up to 5 moves on the desktop version of the system. On Lichess, it's just 1 move ahead, and if you decide to make a pre-move and then change your mind, then you can, assuming your opponent hasn't already moved, cancel that by clicking before your opponent moves. So it can get a little confusing, right? And the system may work slightly differently depending on if you're on a desktop, if you're on a phone, if you're on Lichess, if you're on chess.com. So I think it makes sense to practice it ahead of time in games that aren't particularly important. So what we'll look at later is an example where we actually play against the computer and practice against them. So the main areas when you can pre-move: in the opening, if you're pretty sure you're going to, for example, fianchetto your bishop, you've already played g3 or g6, and bishop g2, bishop g7 is a sensible move, then you may decide to pre-move that. There's a small risk that your opponent might play bishop h6 or bishop h3 in anticipation of your specific pre-move, but it's pretty unlikely. At bullet it might become slightly more likely, but at blitz you will normally get away with this. Recaptures, if you've got, say, a couple of pawns facing off against each other and you think your opponent might capture your pawn, then you could plan a recapture. If your opponent doesn't make the capture, then the recapture would be legal and so wouldn't be executed. And then in the endgame, I find this typically the most useful. In the endgame, you may well be in a phase when it's some kind of mopping up exercise, and maybe you're trying to push your pawn all the way down the board to promotion. Quite often you can do that by pre-moving. So let's look at some examples of those. This is some kind of modern system. Black's just played pawn to d6, but let's suppose that black, before white actually makes a move, decides, yes, I want to play, say, bishop g7. Then black could pre-move bishop g7, and then against almost any reasonable move, knight c3, knight f3, bishop somewhere, that would be a good move, right? The only real risk is bishop h6, and white would have to be pretty sure that black was going to pre-move bishop g7 to make that a reasonable strategy. I mean, if it was a bullet match where you were playing, say, 100 games against the same opponent, then you might get some kind of a dynamic where one player would want to throw in the odd bishop h6 to catch the other player out, or at least to discourage them from doing pre-moves. But at blitz, where typically you're playing different opponents all the time, then it's not really a practical factor. Another opening example, but also a recapture example. So black's played the Scandinavian opening, and the most common move for white is to play pawn takes d5, and then black would typically play either queen takes d5 or maybe knight f6 to try and recapture the pawn with the knight, or maybe even gambit the pawn. So if black was intending to play queen takes d5, then black could quite safely now, before white plays a move, pre-move queen takes d5. If white does something other than playing pawn takes d5, then the pre-move wouldn't be processed, so there's no real risk with that. If, however, black pre-moved knight f6, then there is some kind of risk that white might play the move pawn to e5, and then after knight f6 could just take that knight for free. You might think that's a bit ridiculous, but pawn to e5, quite a few examples on the Lee Chess opening database of that being played, and it's not completely unreasonable, right? As some kind of advanced variation, you see it as, you know, against the Caro-Kann or the French. It's not completely ridiculous. So knight f6, some small risk there. Our next example is also a Scandinavian, and in this one we've moved a few moves ahead. So white's taken on d5, black's recaptured the queen, and then white's played knight c3, and the queen's moved to a5. So by far the most common move here for white would be pawn to d4, and then black might play something like knight f6 or maybe pawn to c6. So black might try and be clever and say, yes, I will pre-move my knight f6 or pawn to c6, and what could possibly go wrong? Well, what could possibly go wrong is that white might play pawn to b4, and if you pre-move knight f6 or pawn to c6, then white is then going to take your queen for nothing. And the excellent feature of this move b4 is that if black hasn't pre-moved and recaptures the pawn, then white can play rook b1 and has quite decent play for the pawn. And if black has pre-moved, then white gets the queen for free. And you might think, well, surely that wouldn't happen, but certainly one of my club colleagues has had this a number of times, and a decent percentage of the time has managed to capture the queen. So it's quite a good practical ploy. The other example is pre-moving in the endgame, and here you see the black king is trapped in the corner. And if like black as a defender, if black wanted to play on maybe because white has only a second or two to finish the job, then black can pre-move king g8 to h8 and save time there, put a little bit more pressure on white. And in the meantime, white has got the king trapped in the corner and can pre-move either one move at a time, as shown by the arrows, or potentially on chess.com could pre-move all of those moves in one go and bring the king, white king, up to the black king, and then prepare the final checkmate. And then, slightly similar, if you're in an endgame and you're trying to promote a pawn, then again you could pre-move that as a series of pre-moves on Lee Chess, or potentially as 5 in one pre-move on chess.com all the way to promotion, get that pawn through. And then you could probably pre-move some of your ladder checkmates with the queen and rook. I mean, you could try and checkmate with the king and rook against the king, but I'm pretty sure that moving the pawn forward using pre-moves would be faster and a little less fiddly than just checkmating with the rook. So that's the theory of pre-moves, and now we'll look at some practice. So I've brought up a Lee Chess homepage, and now I'm going to choose the play with computer option, and I've set it for the very easiest level. Let's take white as well, and let's say that I want to fianchetto. I'm going to play pawn to g3, and then I want to pre-move pawn to g2. So I'm going to try and play those moves quickly. So pawn to g3, and then immediately bishop to g2, and you can see that the square was highlighted just before black replied, and the move did get pre-moved. Now, f6 looks a slightly odd move. Let's say we want to do something even odder and just push our a pawn down the board. No good reason really for that, but let's try and play a4 and then pre-move a5. You should see the square highlight for the pre-move, yeah? Now let's say we're going to pre-move pawn to, or we're going to move pawn to b4, then we're going to pre-move pawn to b5, but then we're going to change our mind, if we do it quickly enough, and then we're going to click on that b5 square and that will cancel the pre-move. So you may need to watch quite carefully. Right click, oh no, I wasn't quick enough, right? So this time I'm going to play pawn to c3, pawn to c4, and then try and change my mind. Yeah, I managed to right click on that in time before black played. The other way you could cancel the pre-move is to do an alternative one. So suppose I was going to play knight f3 and then pre-move h3, but then thought, well, maybe pawn to g4 would be better. So I'm going to play this, I'm going to pre-move h3, but then, oh no, maybe g4 is better. So I got all those in, and I've managed to give up my g-pawn for nothing. Oh no, so black preferred to take the knight anyway. But it's slightly difficult to see because it's quite quick. But that's the essence of pre-moves. Let's look at an example on chess.com now. Right, so I'm on chess.com and I'm going to click on play bot, and let's choose her. I am Christinini. Right, we'll choose that one, friendly. I'm going to play, and I'm white. We'll ignore whatever's been said to us in Spanish, and I'm going to pre-move some moves. But because it's chess.com, I could potentially pre-move quite a few moves ahead. So for no particularly good reason, I'm going to try and pre-move. When I play pawn to a3, then pre-move pawn to a4 and to a5 and a6 if I get a chance to do that. So I'm going to move, pre-move. Yeah, unfortunately black blocked it, right? So I did have a slight concern with that. So we're going to try it with the h-pawn now. So we're going to play h3, then we're going to try and pre-move h4, h5, h6. Probably won't be quick enough for all of that. But I got it to h5, right? You'll see all those moves have been made. So it's slightly confusingly on chess.com, the moves are actually made on the board, so it makes it harder to continue thinking about your move. Nevertheless, it can still be pretty useful. So let's say we want to play pawn to d3, then pre-move knight c3, and then we want to change our mind. So push the pawns, we'll do that. Then I'm going to right click, and then it cancelled the move, right? So I right clicked on the c3 square. So it all happens quite quickly, right? Partly because we're playing a bot that's playing more or less instantaneously. If you're playing bullet, then your opponent would probably be playing at a similar speed, so the chance to retract to pre-move is not so great, right? At Blitz, there's a slightly better chance of doing that. So that's the practical examples. And finally, if you've got comments, questions on the video, please post those. If you like the videos, please subscribe to the channel. And if you really like the videos and you want to consider buying my book, you can find that Better Chess Faster on Amazon. So hopefully see you for the next video.